Hello and welcome to week 4 of the Ciscus Global Enterprise Risk Management Online Symposium. Hi, my name is Bierc, CEO for RPM3 Solutions. You know, in my 15 years experience in enterprise risk management, one thing has consistently rang true, that successful ERM programs have effectively integrated strategic planning and ERM. Today we're going to talk about how you can apply cost of risk as a powerful tool to better integrate your ERM program with strategic planning. In today's session, we're going to first talk about what is cost of risk. I'll then get into why it is so important and determination of such is so important. How we can build an ERM framework around cost of risk. How to insert cost of risk into the risk management process. And then lastly, and most importantly, how cost of risk helps us to integrate ERM and strategic planning. Let's get started. So what is cost of risk? Here's a formal definition that I've come up with. Very simply stated, the aggregate total of all costs incurred by an enterprise, intentionally or unintentionally, as a direct or consequential result of the existence of risk. I'll simplify that even more. Let's put it this way. Any cost that exists or is incurred because risk exists. Let that sink in a little bit, and let's think about how risk creates costs in our business. First of all, the cost of risk could be incurred because of the way you manage your risk in your business. So you are going to manage the risk, and therefore cost is incurred as a result of that. This can be reflected as a risk response strategy, a mitigation strategy, a control. It can even be the cost you incur to try to actualize an opportunity. It doesn't matter, because risk exists, you took action and therefore incurred costs to manage that risk. That's the first way. The second way would be the consequence of risk. And then lastly, revenue can be affected as well. And I call this an opportunity cost or benefit. It could be a good thing or a bad thing. If you've missed your goal on the top line, therefore margin is affected, that's a cost of risk. If you've overperformed against your margin goals, that's a benefit of risk. Either way, we're going to include that as a cost of risk in this calculation. All right, let's look at it this way. Risk creates a unique cost environment, and it has the 3 components we just talked about in that environment. You place your goals, your targets, your business plans, your strategies in this environment. And by the way, this is again why cost of risk is important when you're trying to integrate strategy and enterprise risk management. The strategy or those goals have to deal with this environment, this cost environment, and have to traverse it to be successful. Now let's think about what we're doing in strategic planning. We're going to start talking about drivers, business drivers, and what we need to do in those business drivers to be successful and affect our results. It's these drivers that are going to come in contact with that cost structure directly. Ultimately, that's going to determine our final results, our performance as a business. These drivers get buffeted by this cost of risk environment, and as a result, they affect the final results of the business. So cost of risk affects these drivers and the gap between risks and results. Every business incurs cost. All of the cost of that business is the cost of doing business. However, that cost can be put into 2 broad categories. One is we've got the cost of risk. These are costs that have been incurred because risk exists. And as we mentioned before, it can be costs as a result of managing risk, or it can be the cost that is incurred due to the consequences. The remainder is what I call the cost of core business. So in effect, these costs are costs that are there or exist regardless of whether risk exists or not. The thing that's interesting, and we'll talk about this, is that the cost of risk component of a business is growing in today's environment, making it more and more necessary to understand and quantify if we're going to be successful. Why is cost of risk so important? Very simple. It's all about the Q, quantification. Let's melt down our enterprise risk management black box into simple dollars terms that the C-suite can understand. If our costs are amassing larger and larger, then we need to start isolating these costs, understand them, align them with the key risks in the business, understand the differences between the costs that are incurred to manage risk versus the costs that we incur as a result or as a consequence of risk, and be able to create a grand strategy alongside our business strategy for the business to be successful. So once again, it's all about the Q. Let's break it down a little bit. Why is cost of risk so important? What we just talked about, what I just summarized, is business intelligence that's often overlooked. Nuances, subtleties that exist in the actual results of our company that are missed because the cost of risk is not isolated and looked at independently. These costs are not the same animal as the costs of core business. The costs in core business can easily be reduced to be in alignment with revenue because they work that way. These costs are directly related or are directly tied to the volume in the company. On the other hand, the cost of risk is usually more fixed in nature, and it also is there for a different purpose. You cut these costs, you may actually cut revenue. You cut these costs, you may actually expose the business to a catastrophic loss. So therefore, they must be looked at more precisely and understand why they're incurred and at what levels before any kind of change can be made to them. On the other hand, these costs also have tremendous leverage. As the company grows, often you get economies of scale around these costs. Also, if we're going to be able to isolate cost of risk, we're actually measuring ERM performance itself because we're looking at all the elements that tie into the management of risk enterprise-wide. And because we're looking at it through the lens of the financials of the company, and from a financial planning perspective, we're directly tying risk management back to the strategic planning of the business. All right, so why now? Boy, I think things are changing around the world at a pace that I couldn't have imagined coming out of college 30 years ago. It's a much riskier place today, and as a result, business has to adapt to deal with a lot more risk than it did even 10 years ago. In my business, we've discovered that corporations are absorbing 20 to 50% of revenue as cost of risk. With numbers of that scale, it is critical that this cost be quantified and the companies figure out how to manage and operate and optimize this cost if they're going to plan to be competitive today. It's critical. They're not going to be able to be competitive without it. Let's itemize a few key strategic benefits then before we move on. First of all, cost of risk exposes previously unseen correlations or relationships that exist between the cost structure of the company and its performance. It's because we're peeling back the onion a little bit differently than it was before. Two, we're actually quantifying in dollar terms what the company's risk appetite might be in simple dollars terms. We can see if we're risk takers or if we're not risk takers. We can see if we have too many controls that are restricting growth. All can be seen through the lens of cost of risk. And lastly, we are now creating a metric upon which our ERM activities can be measured. Therefore, we can measure the performance of enterprise risk management itself. This is radical because now the age-old question of show me the value in an ERM program is a thing of the past. We can now measure that using cost of risk terms. Let's move on and let's try to build an ERM framework around cost of risk. All right, first of all, as we talked about, the cost of risk is all the costs incurred, both direct and consequential, that exist as a result of the existence of risk. When we have that information, we can create a baseline before we even begin to develop our ERM programs. We can establish a quantitative link between risk and our company performance because we're going to be able to align cost with the risk in the business itself, even before we begin an ERM program. Well, I'd like to thank everybody for taking the time for me to talk about cost of risk a little bit and how you might be able to use this very powerful tool to integrate your strategic planning and ERM programs. Once again, thank you for joining me and have a great day.